Hi there, Allison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we're in the San Pablo Indicaciones Geográficas of Argentina and we're looking at the Zuccardi 2017 Poligonos de Valle de Uco Cabernet Franc. Sebastián Zuccardi is the third generation in his family to be continuing their legacy of grape growing and winemaking in Mendoza. It was his grandfather that first established their vineyards in Maipu back in 1963. And today, Sebastián is one of the leading winemakers of his generation, and he's deeply committed, curious, and passionate about the terroirs of the Uco Valley. So where's the Uco Valley? The Uco Valley is in sort of the southwest portion of Mendoza. We're tucked up in the foothills of the Andes here, and the climate here is actually considered continental and relatively low rainfall as well. We receive typically 200 to 300 millimeters of rainfall per year. Now the moderating factor here is elevation, of course, and the elevation of the vineyards is typically 850 to upwards to 1900 meters above sea level. That's 2500 to 6500 feet in terms of elevation. Now in the Uco Valley there are three subzones, Tupungato, Tunuyunan, and San Carlos, and this wine is coming from the Tunuyunan subzone, and it's kind of sandwiched in between the other two, with Tupungato to the north and then San Carlos to the south. And geographically speaking, it's bordered to the north by the Las Tunas River and then to the south by the Tunuyunan River. Now if we drill down even further than that, we get into the San Pablo Indicaciones Geográficas, which is IG, of course, for short, and this is like a sub-appellation in the Tunuyunan region here. And this is a relatively small and new sub-appellation in the Tunuyunan region and in the Uco Valley. It was established in 2019, but the history of the viticulture of the region actually dates to the 17th century when it was originally settled by the Jesuit missionaries back in this time, and they were the first ones to cultivate vines in this area, which makes San Pablo actually the oldest region for viticulture in the Tunuyunan region. Now, San Pablo as a sort of sub-appellation is unique in the sense that its borders were actually defined more by terroir than by sort of political factors, which is what is typically what you tend to find in Argentina. Now, San Pablo, as I mentioned, is a smaller appellation. They have 510 hectares under vine, which if we compare that to the more than 28,000 hectares under vine that are in the Uco Valley, this is a really small kind of piece of the puzzle here. Now there's two distinct sort of microclimates in San Pablo. To the east, where we're kind of in a slightly lower elevation of 1100 or so meters above sea level, we will have a slightly warmer microclimate. And then as we sort of move west into the foothills of the Andes and sort of into these mountain sites, we get into a cooler microclimate because we're at a higher elevation. And then there's more rainfall here, upwards to 500 millimeters of rainfall per year, which is almost double what is typical for the Uco Valley. Now, if we drill down even further than that, this wine is coming from a single vineyard site, Finca Las Cuchillas, that was planted in 2013. And this site, it's 40 hectares in total in terms of the viticultural plantings, and it's 4.2 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines. The vineyard sits at about 1,400 meters or so above sea level, so we're kind of in that western portion, that mountain site, that higher elevation site. So we are dealing with a slightly cooler microclimate where this Cab Franc is coming from. And Sebastián explained to me that the Cab Franc vines here at Finca Las Cuchillas has two sort of specific sort of purposes. The top selection will go into the Poligonos Cabernet Franc, and then the rest will be declassified, so to speak, and it'll go into their Zuccardi Q Cabernet Franc. Now the soils here, of course, we're dealing with ancient alluvial river deposited soils that were formed around 1 million years ago. And in the vineyard, we have a sandy loam topsoil that ranges in depth from as little as 0.5 meter to upwards to 1.3 meters. That's 1.5 to 4 feet or so in terms of the depth of the topsoil. And then we get down even further than that, we have the subsoil, which is quite unique. We have these larger sort of river stones that are actually granite, and then there's this calcium carbonate layer on top of the granite, which is kind of interesting. And Sebastián explains that this is a very rare sort of stone, that there's only a few sites in the Uco Valley that have this particular rock to it. Now, from a winemaking perspective, this saw very traditional fermentation with indigenous yeast, and the preferred vessel for all of Sebastián's winemaking and ferments is concrete. And these vessels were designed to resemble amphoras. They're on the larger side, but they all do have this sort of conical shape, and they are unlined as well, which is important because, unlined concrete will have sort of a porous element to it, so there's a nice oxygen exchange here, and Cab Franc does have a tendency CO2 reduction, or for reduction, I should say. So this oxygen exchange is really good for Cab Franc. It spent about 15 days on skins, and there was some regular pigeage during the active fermentation to kind of work the cap a little bit. And then it was aged in 2,500 liter oak foudre for about 12 months before bottling. So let's tuck in. Now the nose does have a really nice kind of lift and perfume to it, which sometimes I get when there's a sandy element to the topsoils. There's this extra little bit of perfume. The fruits do lean a little bit darker, but there is a sort of brambly kind of element. There's some black currant here. There's a little bit of black and red raspberry. There's a little plum here. But there's a nice savory edge to the nose, which I quite like. The pyrazines kind of come through nicely in tandem with the fruit at a moderate level, and there's a sort of a whole host of things going on here. And I got like a little bit of mint. I'm getting a little bit of like an evergreen element, which I wrote in my notes, spruce tips, which is a really weird thing, but that's sort of what came to me. It's not cedar, but spruce is sort of what I thought of. And then there's also this kind of olive element, which sometimes I get with Cab Franc from warmer climates. There's this sort of like green or black olive kind of thing coming on in terms of the pyrazines, which sort of comes through a little bit for me on this. But the nose is pure fruited, leans a little bit sweeter as opposed to tart, and it does have a nice sort of savory edge to it as well. On the palate, this is really sort of lively acidity. There's a nice kind of mouth-watering impact here as well. And the fruits are confirmed very similarly to they were on the nose, with this sort of additional sweet baking spice element on the palate. And there's a touch more of kind of a red fruit note on the palate as well, which is nice because it adds a certain degree of sort of freshness to the wine. Now, what makes this wine really particular is the tannins. There's a certain creaminess to the mouthfeel in terms of the texture of the overall profile of the palate, and then sort of the tannins. And I think that this has to do with sort of the altitude factor here. So it's as if there's a certain degree of viscosity or weight, or like there's an extra kind of glycerol or dry extract component to this wine, which is adding to this certain degree of heft or weight to the palate in terms of the overall texture. And we have to remember that when we're dealing with higher altitudes, we have thicker skins on the varieties, so there's a higher skin to juice ratio. So the impact of the skins, as far as all of those properties that are in the skins, is going to impact the wines. We get more color, we get more texture, and we get a little bit more sort of mouthfeel here for sure. The tannins, though, are supple. They have a nice sort of satiny texture to them, but they do have a certain degree of sort of weight and sort of almost luxuriousness in terms of how they feel on the palate. But the nice thing, though, is there is that freshness, and there is sort of a certain degree of structure that comes in at the end. The tannins sort of finish with this sort of dryness, a little bit of grip, and it sort of cinches in the whole wine and kind of brings it all together, which is really nice. The overall profile of this wine is it's really balanced, and it does have a certain sort of weight, fullness, forwardness about it, and the sort of richness that I would expect from sort of a slightly warmer climate Cabernet Franc. But at the same time, there is a certain degree of finesse and restraint and a reserved character to the wine, which I think it balances it really nicely. There is a nice yin and yang here. Now, we have to keep in mind that these vines were quite young when this wine was made, about 4 years. So what I am getting is there's some great potential to the site. I can sense that this is a good site, and I look forward to sort of seeing how with extra age and sort of more sort of experience in terms of winemaking with this particular vineyard. But I dig this Cab Franc, and I like sort of all the elements. There's a lot going on here, and it's really exciting. But it's something that I certainly would recommend seeking out for sure. And if you have a favorite Cab Franc from Argentina, let me know what it is in the comments below, of course. And I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.